Jack Thompson had always considered himself a tough guy. At 68, he was in decent shape, for his age. The wrinkles around his eyes were the result of years spent in the sun, a life of hard work and even harder lessons. He'd spent decades in the construction business, often working long hours, building homes and skyscrapers. His hands, calloused and weathered, could fix anything. His legs, strong and sturdy, had carried him through years of hard labor. Yet, he never thought much about the toll the years might take on his body. It was late one night when everything changed. The soft hum of the ceiling fan barely filled the quiet of Jack's bedroom. The room was dark except for the soft glow of a nightlight by the door. Jack had always been a light sleeper, but tonight, something was different. He was just beginning to drift into sleep when he suddenly felt it, a sharp, excruciating pain in his calf. His leg tensed, muscles seizing up as if something was trying to break free from his skin. Jack shot up in bed, gasping for air as the pain in his leg worsened. He gripped his shin, writhing in agony. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, his mind racing in confusion. He'd never experienced a cramp like this before. The pain was so intense it felt as if his leg might snap in two. He tried to stretch it out, but the muscle refused to release. The more he tried, the more his body betrayed him. "Not now," he muttered under his breath, clenching his teeth. He gripped the edge of his nightstand, trying to focus on anything other than the sharp pain. But nothing worked. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had heard of older folks getting cramps from time to time, but Jack never thought it would happen to him. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the cramp subsided, leaving him sweating and exhausted, but he could still feel the lingering tightness in his leg. Jack lay back down, breathing heavily, staring at the ceiling. It was just a cramp, he told himself. Nothing more. But the unsettling thought lingered, what if it wasn't just a cramp? What if there was something deeper going on with his health that he wasn't paying attention to? As he tried to fall back asleep, Jack couldn't help but think about the stories he'd heard, stories of older men like him who started to face strange health problems, ones they ignored for too long. Was this the first sign of something more serious? He didn't want to admit it, but the fear was starting to creep in. The next morning, Jack sat on the edge of his bed, massaging his leg. The pain had mostly faded, but he couldn't shake the nagging worry. He stood up, stretching carefully, trying to test his leg, but it still felt a little stiff. Emily, his daughter, called him around noon. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "How's everything going?" Jack paused, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to worry her, but he couldn't shake the memory of the intense pain he'd felt the night before. "I'm doing okay," he said, trying to sound convincing. "Just had a little cramp in my leg last night. Nothing to worry about." "Dad, you've got to be more careful," Emily replied, concern evident in her voice. "Maybe it's time you saw a doctor about these things. You can't just brush them off." Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm fine, Emily. It was just a cramp." But Emily wasn't convinced. "Dad, you're not getting any younger. You've got to take care of yourself. I'll make an appointment for you. How about next week?" Jack hesitated. He hated the idea of going to the doctor. He'd spent most of his life trying to tough things out, believing that everything could be solved with a little grit and determination. But this cramp, it made him question things. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe it was time to start paying attention to his body. "I'll think about it," Jack muttered. Emily, sensing his reluctance, didn't push the issue. "Okay, but I'm serious, Dad. You're not invincible. Please take care of yourself." After hanging up, Jack sat quietly, staring out the window. He had always been the type of man who kept his feelings to himself. But for the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable. Was this just a sign of aging? Or was his body telling him something more? Jack's thoughts wandered, and he began thinking about the stories he'd read over the years, stories of people who managed to defy the odds by changing their diet, their lifestyle, or even their mindset. One story, in particular, stood out. It was about Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur known for his work with SpaceX and Tesla. Musk, despite his hectic schedule and stress, had somehow managed to maintain a remarkable level of health, even as he got older. Jack had never been particularly interested in Musk's personal life, but the idea that a man who seemed to juggle 1,000 projects could maintain such great health intrigued him. Maybe it's his diet, Jack muttered to himself. He had heard that Musk followed a particular eating regimen to maintain energy and health, something that helped him avoid common issues as he aged. It was a long shot, but Jack felt desperate to try anything. He could keep ignoring his body, or he could take a leap of faith and try something different. Jack opened his laptop and started researching Elon Musk's diet. The search results weren't groundbreaking, but there were mentions of foods Musk ate to maintain energy, reduce stress, and, most importantly, avoid things like leg cramps. Jack clicked through a few articles, intrigued. One consistent theme seemed to be foods rich in potassium, magnesium, and omega-3 fatty acids, foods like bananas, spinach, and fish. Jack's mind began to race. Could these foods really make a difference in preventing cramps? He wasn't sure, but what did he have to lose? With a renewed sense of determination, Jack made up his mind. Tomorrow, he would head to the grocery store. He would try to follow this advice and see if it made any difference. Maybe, just maybe, it would be the solution he was searching for. And so, with a plan in mind, Jack decided to take control of his health, one meal at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jack Thompson wasn't the kind of man who asked for help. He'd always prided himself on being self-sufficient, able to handle whatever life threw his way. Growing up in a small town in upstate New York, he'd learned early on that the world wasn't going to hand you anything, you had to work for it. His father, a stern but fair man, had instilled that lesson into him at a young age. Jack's mother, on the other hand, was the soft heart of the family. She always worried, always cared. She'd make sure Jack had everything he needed, even when times were tough. She taught him how to cook, how to treat people with kindness, and how to take care of himself when things didn't go according to plan. But it was his father's resilience that had shaped him the most. His dad was a carpenter, and Jack had followed in his footsteps, working alongside him from the time he was a teenager. By the time Jack was in his 20s, he was already a skilled construction worker, capable of building just about anything from the ground up. Jack's career in construction had been a long and successful one. For over 40 years, he'd worked on projects across the state, from small homes to massive office buildings. He loved the work, the feeling of creating something with his hands, the satisfaction of seeing a project come to life. It was hard work, grueling at times, but Jack thrived on it. He was known for his no-nonsense attitude and his ability to get things done, no matter the obstacles. The company he worked for trusted him, and over the years, Jack became a foreman. He ran the job sites, coordinated the teams, and made sure every project was finished on time and within budget. But construction was a young man's game. As the years went by, Jack began to notice the toll it was taking on his body. His back ached more than it ever had, and the long hours on his feet left him exhausted. His knees, once strong and capable, started to crack with every movement. But Jack didn't complain. He pushed through, just like he always had. After all, that's what his father would have done. By the time he hit 60, Jack's body started to slow down, and that's when he decided to retire. It wasn't an easy decision. He wasn't the kind of man who liked sitting idle. But the constant pain in his joints, his lower back, and his legs finally became too much to ignore. He moved to a small house on the outskirts of town, a quiet place where he could enjoy his retirement and focus on taking care of his health. It was strange, though. For the first time in his life, Jack didn't have a purpose. The job that had defined him for decades was gone, and he was left with the silence of his own thoughts. He spent his days reading, gardening, and tinkering with old projects in his garage, but it wasn't the same. He missed the hustle, the camaraderie of working alongside others. The feeling of building something that would stand the test of time, was no longer part of his life. And the ache in his bones didn't help matters. Emily, his daughter, had tried to convince him to move closer to her in the city, but Jack refused. He didn't want to be a burden, and he cherished the solitude his small town offered. Besides, Emily had her own family to take care of. She was busy with her career, her husband, and their 2 kids. Jack didn't want to be in the way. So, he stayed in his little house, living a life of quiet routine. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy his time with Emily, he loved her more than anything. She was his only child, and she had always been his pride and joy. She'd grown up to be a strong, independent woman, just like he'd hoped. But as Emily grew older, their relationship had shifted. It wasn't that they didn't care for each other, but the distance between them had grown. They'd fallen into the routine of the occasional phone call or weekend visit, but Jack often felt like he was just a shadow in her busy life. Still, he didn't mind. He was used to being independent, and besides, he had his health to worry about. Or so he thought. It wasn't until that fateful night, the night of the crippling leg cramp, that Jack realized just how much he had been neglecting his own well-being. The realization hit him hard. He was no longer invincible. His body, once as strong as an ox, was starting to betray him. And for the first time, he found himself at a crossroads. The cramp wasn't just a sign of aging. It was a wake-up call. Jack wasn't ready to slow down. He still had plenty of life left to live, plenty of things he wanted to do. But he needed to take better care of himself if he was going to keep moving forward. That's when he remembered something he'd heard about Elon Musk. It was a casual mention in a conversation years ago, but it stuck with him. Musk, the tech mogul and space pioneer, was known for his work ethic, his ability to juggle multiple ventures at once. Yet, despite his demanding schedule, Musk had somehow managed to maintain a level of health that most people his age couldn't achieve. It wasn't just luck. It was the result of a disciplined lifestyle, one that included specific foods, exercises, and practices that kept him in peak condition. Jack had never been particularly interested in Musk's personal life, but now, that tidbit of information felt like a lifeline. If Musk could keep his health in check with a crazy schedule, maybe Jack could do the same. Maybe he could still turn things around. He wasn't ready to give up yet. And so, the idea began to form. Jack would take control of his health, starting with his diet. He wasn't a fan of drastic changes, but if Musk had figured something out, maybe it was worth a shot. He didn't have much to lose, except the persistent pain in his legs, of course. Jack wasn't sure where this new path would take him, but he felt a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was worth trying. After all, the greatest buildings were built from the ground up, and maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild his health the same way. Jack sat at his kitchen table, staring at the computer screen in front of him. He had spent the better part of the morning reading about the benefits of certain foods that could help prevent leg cramps, and his mind was buzzing with new information. Potassium, magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, these were the key ingredients that had come up time and time again. It was a simple enough solution, really. It wasn't about reinventing the wheel or making drastic changes to his lifestyle, but it was going to require discipline. Something Jack hadn't really thought much about in years. The first step, he realized, was to get to the grocery store. But he was a creature of habit, and that meant his pantry was full of the usual suspects, canned goods, frozen meals, and the occasional snack food that he would munch on while watching TV. He had no real interest in cooking elaborate meals for himself, and his meals usually consisted of quick fixes, a sandwich, some canned soup, or a frozen dinner that took little effort to prepare. But this was different. This time, he was going to take control of his diet. No more excuses. His leg cramp had been a wake-up call, and he wasn't going to ignore it any longer. Jack grabbed his keys, slid them into his pocket, and headed out the door. The grocery store was only a few miles away, but it felt like a journey in itself. He hadn't been shopping in weeks. Most of his meals were quick and convenient, and that meant he wasn't thinking about nutrition. It was just whatever he could throw together with the least amount of effort. As he drove through the quiet streets of his small town, Jack found himself thinking about his father. His dad had been a no-nonsense kind of guy. He didn't care for fancy foods or diets, he believed in eating what you needed to get by, and that was it. But Jack's father never had to deal with the aches and pains that came with aging. And Jack, like many people his age, was realizing that he couldn't take his health for granted anymore. The parking lot of the grocery store was nearly empty, a rare sight on a Tuesday afternoon. Jack pulled into a spot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, taking in the quiet. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, exactly. He had a list of foods to buy, sure, but it was all new territory for him. He wasn't used to spending so much time thinking about what he ate. He walked through the automatic doors of the store and grabbed a shopping cart, his mind already racing with the items he needed to pick up. Bananas for potassium, spinach for magnesium, salmon for omega-3s. Simple things, but it felt foreign to him. He was used to grabbing whatever was on sale, not worrying about how it would affect his health. As he made his way through the aisles, Jack couldn't help but notice how many choices there were. It was overwhelming. The shelves were lined with colorful boxes and packages that promised convenience, but he knew that wasn't what he needed right now. He was looking for real food, the kind that would nourish him, not just fill him up. He passed the canned vegetables, the pre-packaged meals, and the frozen dinners, shaking his head as he went. These weren't the kinds of foods he needed anymore. He headed straight for the produce section, where the fresh fruits and vegetables were lined up like a rainbow of possibilities. Jack reached for a bunch of bananas and tossed them into his cart. They were a simple, easy choice, and he knew they'd help with the potassium. Next, he grabbed a bag of spinach, something he never thought to buy before. But it seemed like the right choice, and he was committed to trying something new. He wasn't sure how he was going to prepare it, but he figured he could toss it into a salad or add it to a smoothie. Either way, it was a start. Walking through the aisles, Jack continued to fill his cart. He found some fresh salmon and added it to the pile, remembering that omega-3 fatty acids were another key nutrient for reducing inflammation. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about stopping leg cramps, it was about giving his body the fuel it needed to keep going. It was about taking care of himself in a way he hadn't before. By the time Jack made it to the checkout, his cart was filled with fresh produce, lean proteins, and whole grains. It wasn't much, just the basics, but it felt like a huge step forward. As he drove home, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just a trip to the grocery store. It was a decision, a turning point. He had taken action, and that felt good. For the first time in a long while, he was taking control of his health in a way that wasn't about just surviving, but about thriving. Back at home, Jack unpacked the groceries and set them out on the counter. It felt strange, in a good way. He had always been a man who knew how to build things, but today, he was starting to build something else, his health. He looked at the bananas, the spinach, the salmon, and smiled to himself. It wasn't going to be easy. He was going to have to make some changes. But it was a start. He spent the next hour putting together a simple meal, a salad with spinach, tomatoes, and a piece of grilled salmon. It wasn't much, but it was a far cry from the frozen meals he had been eating before. As he sat down to eat, Jack felt a sense of pride. This was the beginning of something new, something he hadn't done for himself in years. While eating, Jack thought about the future. He wasn't sure how long it would take for him to start feeling the effects of the changes he was making, but he was determined. This wasn't just about stopping leg cramps, it was about taking care of himself, about giving himself the chance to feel good again. And for the first time in a while, Jack felt hopeful. As he cleaned up after dinner, he thought back to the conversation with Emily. She had been right to worry about him, even if he hadn't wanted to admit it. Maybe he wasn't invincible, but that didn't mean he couldn't still take care of himself. One step at a time. And today, that step had been to change what he ate. Jack wiped his hands on the dish towel, standing tall as he looked out the kitchen window. The night had fallen, but for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel quite so alone. He had taken control. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was worth it. Tomorrow was another day, and Jack Thompson was ready for it. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light through the trees. He stretched out in bed, feeling a faint ache in his lower back, a reminder of his years of hard labor. But today, it was different. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was simply enduring the day. He felt like he was stepping into something new. Yesterday's decision to change his diet had been the first step, but Jack knew that he couldn't just stop there. He had to create a routine that would help him stay on track. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined. He was 65, and if he was going to make the most out of the years he had left, he had to start somewhere. Today would be a fresh start, and he had no intention of wasting it. Jack got up, pulling on his old sneakers, the ones that had seen better days, and headed to the kitchen. The night before, he had prepped a simple breakfast, a smoothie made from bananas, spinach, and a scoop of protein powder. He'd read about how green smoothies were packed with nutrients and easy on the stomach, so he thought he'd give it a try. The blender hummed as Jack mixed the ingredients together. The smell of fresh bananas and spinach filled the kitchen, and for a brief moment, he found himself smiling. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he sipped the smoothie, Jack made a mental note of how he felt. The first few sips were surprisingly pleasant, the sweetness of the bananas cutting through the earthiness of the spinach. He wasn't used to drinking his meals, but it wasn't as bad as he'd expected. In fact, it felt refreshing. After finishing, he felt more energized than he had in ages. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give him the motivation to keep going. With breakfast down, Jack moved on to the next item on his list, stretching. He'd heard that regular stretching could help with leg cramps and joint pain, and he was willing to give anything a try. He wasn't exactly the most flexible guy, but he figured it couldn't hurt. Jack shuffled over to the living room and stood by the couch, unsure of where to start. He had never been one for yoga or fancy stretching routines, but he knew the basics. He stretched his arms above his head, then bent down to touch his toes, feeling the stretch in his hamstrings. The motion was slow and deliberate, and he could feel the tightness in his muscles. He wasn't quite sure how long he should hold each position, so he went with what felt right. His back twinged a bit when he reached down, but he pushed through it. Jack wasn't about to let his body win. This was his time to take charge. After a few minutes of stretching, Jack felt a slight increase in his flexibility, and he couldn't help but feel a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was something. The tightness in his legs wasn't gone, but there was a slight relief, a feeling of openness that he hadn't experienced in a while. With the stretching complete, Jack moved on to his next task, a walk. He had always been a man of action, so walking around the block seemed like a good place to start. It wasn't too far, but it would get his blood moving and give him a chance to clear his head. He stepped outside, feeling the cool morning air against his skin. The world seemed quiet and still, and for a moment, it felt like everything was in its place. Jack took a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs, and began to walk down the driveway. His joints popped and creaked as he moved, but with each step, he felt more alive. The walk was slow, but that was okay. Jack didn't need to be fast, he just needed to keep moving. He passed by the neighbor's house, nodding politely at Mrs. Parker, who was tending to her flowers. He had lived on this street for years, and the people here were like family. They knew each other's routines, and though he hadn't seen much of them lately, Jack felt a connection to the town that he hadn't realized he'd missed. As he walked, Jack thought about the changes he was making. It wasn't just about food or exercise. It was about a mindset shift. For so long, he had been content to simply let life happen around him. But now, he was actively taking control. The leg cramps were just a symptom of something deeper, a life that had been put on autopilot. Now, he was choosing to make every day count. By the time he finished his walk, Jack was sweating lightly and feeling invigorated. His legs still ached a little, but it wasn't as bad as before. He felt like he had done something good for himself, and that alone was worth it. Back at home, Jack grabbed a bottle of water and sat down at the kitchen table, his legs stretching out in front of him. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind of tired that came from doing something worthwhile. He took a long sip of water, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could do next. The plan was simple: keep going. Keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps. He thought about his daughter, Emily. She would be proud of him, he knew that. She had always been supportive, even when he didn't want to listen. She had tried to get him to take better care of himself before, but Jack had brushed her off. But now, for the first time, he felt like he could truly make a change. The world didn't owe him anything, but that didn't mean he couldn't take what he needed from it. Jack wasn't done. Not by a long shot. There was still a lot of life left to live. Jack stood up, feeling a surge of energy he hadn't felt in years. He had a long road ahead of him, but this was only the beginning. The first step had been taken, and the next one was already on the horizon. The days seemed to blend together in a rhythm Jack hadn't experienced in years. Each morning, he woke up early, feeling the familiar stiffness in his muscles, but now he had a new sense of purpose. The aching legs, the stiffness in his back, and the fatigue were still present, but they no longer ruled his day. Every time he made a healthy decision, it felt like a small victory, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. That morning, Jack woke up to the sound of his alarm, a gentle buzz that signified the start of another day. He had started setting an alarm for his morning routine, no more sleeping in or hitting the snooze button. Getting out of bed had been hard in the beginning, but now it was becoming second nature. He pulled himself up, stretching his arms toward the ceiling before getting dressed in his old, worn workout clothes. They weren't fancy, but they served their purpose. Jack had been sticking to his new routine for over a week now. He was drinking smoothies for breakfast, sticking to home-cooked meals, and walking every day. The stretching exercises he had added to his morning routine had made a noticeable difference. The tightness in his muscles had started to ease, and while he still felt some discomfort, it wasn't the constant, debilitating pain he had grown accustomed to. There were other, less obvious changes too. His energy levels were higher, and he found that he didn't get as tired during the day. He had even started to sleep better at night, which was a huge relief. In the past, Jack had struggled with restlessness, often waking up in the middle of the night, his mind racing. But now, he found himself drifting off to sleep with ease. It was as if his body was finally getting the rest it had been craving for years. After a quick breakfast, Jack decided to take a walk around the block, just like the day before. His legs were still a little stiff, but as he moved, he noticed they felt a bit stronger. He wasn't walking as slowly as he had at first, and the tightness in his calves wasn't as bad. Jack smiled to himself as he passed Mrs. Parker's house again. She waved from her front porch, and Jack waved back, feeling a little more connected to the world around him. During his walk, Jack thought about how far he had come. He had always been a man who liked to take action, but until recently, that had meant avoiding things like self-care. He'd always been too busy, too focused on work, too focused on everything else to focus on himself. Now, he was realizing how important it was to take care of his body, to listen to it, and to give it what it needed. It wasn't about vanity or trying to look young again, it was about giving himself the best chance at feeling good, for as long as possible. As Jack returned home, he made himself a quick lunch, a simple salad with grilled chicken, avocado, and a handful of almonds for a boost of healthy fats. He was still getting used to eating whole, unprocessed foods, but it was starting to feel normal. Gone were the days of reaching for frozen pizza or microwaving a TV dinner. He had learned that food could be delicious and nourishing, and he didn't have to sacrifice flavor for health. That afternoon, Jack received a call from Emily. It had been a few days since they last spoke, and Jack's heart warmed at the sound of her voice. "Hey, Dad," she said. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing good, Em," Jack replied. "Better than I have in a long time, actually." "Really?" she asked, sounding surprised. "What's going on?" "I've been sticking to my new routine," Jack said, a sense of pride creeping into his voice. "Eating better, walking every day, and doing some stretching. It's not perfect, but I can already feel the difference." Emily was quiet for a moment, processing what he had said. "Dad, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you. I knew you could do it." Jack chuckled softly. "Well, I'm just getting started. I still have a long way to go, but I'm feeling good about it. Actually, I think it's helping my legs. The cramps aren't as bad as they used to be." "See? I told you those changes would help," Emily said. "You're doing great, Dad." Jack smiled. It was the first time in a long time that he felt truly proud of himself. It wasn't about accomplishing something huge, it was about consistency, about making small changes every day that added up to something bigger. He was taking care of himself in ways he hadn't in years, and it felt good. "Thanks, Em," Jack said. "It means a lot to hear that." "Well, don't forget about me when you start running marathons," Emily teased. After a quick breakfast, Jack decided to take a walk around the block, just like the day before. His legs were still a little stiff, but as he moved, he noticed they felt a bit stronger. He wasn't walking as slowly as he had at first, and the tightness in his calves wasn't as bad. Jack smiled to himself as he passed Mrs. Parker's house again. She waved from her front porch, and Jack waved back, feeling a little more connected to the world around him. During his walk, Jack thought about how far he had come. He had always been a man who liked to take action, but until recently, that had meant avoiding things like self-care. He'd always been too busy, too focused on work, too focused on everything else to focus on himself. Now, he was realizing how important it was to take care of his body, to listen to it, and to give it what it needed. It wasn't about vanity or trying to look young again, it was about giving himself the best chance at feeling good, for as long as possible. As Jack returned home, he made himself a quick lunch, a simple salad with grilled chicken, avocado, and a handful of almonds for a boost of healthy fats. He was still getting used to eating whole, unprocessed foods, but it was starting to feel normal. Gone were the days of reaching for frozen pizza or microwaving a TV dinner. He had learned that food could be delicious and nourishing, and he didn't have to sacrifice flavor for health. That afternoon, Jack received a call from Emily. It had been a few days since they last spoke, and Jack's heart warmed at the sound of her voice. "Hey, Dad," she said. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing good, Em," Jack replied. "Better than I have in a long time, actually." "Really?" she asked, sounding surprised. "What's going on?" "I've been sticking to my new routine," Jack said, a sense of pride creeping into his voice. "Eating better, walking every day, and doing some stretching. It's not perfect, but I can already feel the difference." Emily was quiet for a moment, processing what he had said. "Dad, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you. I knew you could do it." Jack chuckled softly. "Well, I'm just getting started. I still have a long way to go, but I'm feeling good about it. Actually, I think it's helping my legs. The cramps aren't as bad as they used to be." "See? I told you those changes would help," Emily said. "You're doing great, Dad." Jack smiled. It was the first time in a long time that he felt truly proud of himself. It wasn't about accomplishing something huge, it was about consistency, about making small changes every day that added up to something bigger. He was taking care of himself in ways he hadn't in years, and it felt good. "Thanks, Jack said. "It means a lot to hear that." "Well, don't forget about me when you start running marathons," Emily teased. After a few moments, Jack swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up slowly. His legs protested, but he wasn't going to let them win. He shuffled into the bathroom, splashed some cold water on his face, and looked at himself in the mirror. The face staring back at him was one he recognized, but there was something different, something that hadn't been there before. A spark. A quiet determination. He was still facing the same challenges, the leg cramps, the stiffness in his joints, but he had learned that it was not about eliminating the struggles. It was about learning how to push through them. To make adjustments when necessary, but to keep moving forward. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. Jack grabbed his phone and tapped on the Notes app, jotting down a quick message to Emily. "Hey, Em. The cramps are back today. It's tough, but I'm going to keep going. I'll try a different stretch routine, see if that helps. How's everything on your end?" As he hit send, he remembered how Emily had warned him that progress wasn't linear. There would be good days and bad days, and that was okay. The key was to stay consistent, to keep at it even when it felt like the road ahead was full of obstacles. He had learned this from her over the years, persistence was everything. A few minutes later, Emily replied with a simple message. "Keep going, Dad. You've got this. Try focusing on your breathing during stretches. And maybe add magnesium to your routine. I heard it can help with cramps." Jack smiled at the message. It was so typical of Emily to give him the extra push he needed, even when she wasn't physically there. It was a comfort, knowing that his daughter believed in him, even when he sometimes doubted himself. He decided to take Emily's advice and incorporated magnesium into his routine. He'd read somewhere that it could help with muscle cramps, so why not give it a try? It felt like a small step, but it was something he could do to help himself feel better. But beyond the magnesium, Jack knew he needed to adjust his approach to stretching. He'd been doing basic stretches, but maybe he needed to focus on specific areas that might be triggering the cramps. He got out his tablet, pulling up a video of leg stretches for seniors. Jack wasn't exactly a fan of online videos, he was more of a get out there and do it kind of guy, but he figured it couldn't hurt. The video showed a slow, deliberate routine, with an emphasis on deep, mindful breathing. Jack had to admit that the instructor's calm voice and gentle guidance were soothing. He followed along, moving his legs carefully and stretching in a way that felt different from his usual approach. As he held each stretch, he focused on his breath, inhaling slowly through his nose and exhaling through his mouth. The tightness in his legs seemed to ease with each deep breath. Jack was surprised by how much more relaxed he felt by the end of the session. His legs still hurt a little, but it wasn't the sharp, jarring pain he'd felt earlier. This discomfort was more manageable, more bearable. "I think this is helping," he muttered to himself, feeling a sense of relief. By the time Jack finished his stretches, he was already feeling better. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was progress, and that's all he needed. He made a mental note to keep up with the magnesium supplement and the new stretching routine, but more than anything, he was reminded of the importance of perseverance. Setbacks were inevitable, but it wasn't about avoiding them. It was about adjusting and moving forward anyway. Later that afternoon, Jack took another walk around the block. The cramps had eased somewhat, but there was still a faint ache in his calves. It didn't matter. He wasn't going to let it stop him. The fresh air was good for him. His legs may not have been perfect, but they were moving, and that was all that mattered. During his walk, Jack passed a few neighbors, including Tom, who lived 2 doors down. Tom had always been an active guy, someone who jogged every morning and seemed to have boundless energy. Jack had always admired his stamina, but he'd never really felt like he could keep up. Today, though, he didn't feel bad about it. He was making his own progress, in his own time. "Hey, Jack," Tom called out as he jogged past. "How's it going?" "Not bad, Tom," Jack replied, with a grin. "Taking it one step at a time." Tom slowed his pace, nodding in understanding. "That's the way to do it. Don't push yourself too hard." Jack nodded, watching as Tom continued his jog down the street. There was something reassuring about seeing someone else who was in motion, doing their own thing at their own pace. It was a reminder that everyone's journey was different. What mattered most was showing up and doing the work, day in and day out. That night, Jack sat down for dinner, enjoying a simple grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. He hadn't felt this good in a long time. The setbacks were still there, but they didn't feel as insurmountable as they once did. He knew the road to full recovery was a marathon, not a sprint. But with each small step, he was getting closer to where he wanted to be. As Jack finished his meal, he couldn't help but reflect on how much he had already accomplished. The changes he had made, the walks, the healthier food, the stretching, were small, but they were building into something big. They were making him stronger, both physically and mentally. And he knew that, no matter how many setbacks he faced, he had what it took to keep going. Jack woke up earlier than usual on a Thursday morning. The familiar stiffness in his legs was there again, but it wasn't as bad as before. He stretched them gently and felt a slight twinge, but nothing that made him want to crawl back under the covers. This was progress, he realized. It had been 3 weeks since he started his new routine, and he was beginning to understand just how powerful consistency could be. The changes weren't drastic, but they were real. The persistent cramps that had once dominated his life were now only an occasional nuisance, a shadow of their former selves. Jack wasn't quite ready to run a marathon, far from it, but he could tell his body was slowly responding to the care he was giving it. He pulled on his workout clothes, now becoming second nature, and made his way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. A simple smoothie with spinach, banana, and almond milk. He'd added chia seeds and flax seed to the mix after reading that they were good for inflammation. His diet was evolving, and while it wasn't always exciting, it was becoming more habitual. The smoothies were easy, quick, and nutritious. Most importantly, they helped him feel like he was doing something good for his body, and that was enough motivation. Jack didn't hesitate before starting his stretching routine, which had become an essential part of his day. Today, though, he decided to change it up a bit. He'd read about a specific stretching sequence for seniors that targeted the calves, hamstrings, and lower back, areas that often caused him discomfort. Jack set his tablet down on the kitchen counter, where he could follow the steps without feeling rushed. The instructor on the video was calm and encouraging, guiding Jack through each movement slowly and methodically. As Jack followed along, he could feel the tightness in his calves begin to loosen. The stretching didn't eliminate the discomfort entirely, but it definitely helped. He focused on his breathing, just as Emily had suggested, and found a rhythm in his movements that felt surprisingly soothing. "Good, Jack," the instructor's voice said warmly. "Remember to breathe deeply and let go of any tension in your body. It's all about progress, not perfection." Jack nodded to himself, taking the advice to heart. Progress, not perfection. That was something he could work with. There would always be days when he felt pain or discomfort, but it didn't have to stop him. It didn't have to mean he was failing. Each day was a chance to improve, even if just a little. When he finished the stretching session, Jack felt a sense of calm he hadn't felt in a long time. The tightness in his legs was still there, but it was manageable, almost like a minor annoyance compared to the pain he used to experience. He grabbed a glass of water, his mind clearer than before. It wasn't just his body that was benefiting from this new routine, it was his entire mindset. At work, Jack noticed the shift. He had been more focused and productive lately, something he hadn't expected. His mind used to be filled with worries about his health, his aging body, and the daily aches. But now, He was spending less time thinking about his discomfort and more time tackling tasks at hand. He wasn't consumed by pain anymore, he had control over it, and that made all the difference. His colleagues noticed the change too. A few days ago, Bob, from the accounting department, had stopped by his desk with a smile. "Jack, I have to say, you're looking better these days," Bob remarked, giving him a sideways glance. "You've lost some weight, right? What's your secret?" Jack chuckled, shrugging modestly. "Nothing too fancy, just eating better, walking, and stretching more. Taking care of myself a little more, you know." "Well, it's working," Bob said. "Keep it up." Jack was taken aback by the compliment, but it made him feel good. It felt like a small victory. He hadn't been expecting to get noticed for his health efforts, but hearing it from someone else made the progress feel real. It wasn't just his perception of his own health, others could see it too. By lunchtime, Jack had already put in a productive morning. His mind wasn't scattered with thoughts of how much his legs hurt or how exhausted he was. He felt present, alert, and surprisingly energetic. A few months ago, a morning like this would have been unthinkable. He'd wake up tired, push through work, and count down the minutes until he could rest again. But now, there was a sense of clarity and energy that fueled him throughout the day. Jack decided to take a break in the afternoon and go for a walk. He had been walking every day now, but today felt different. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, and the leaves on the trees were starting to turn shades of orange and yellow, a sign that fall was coming. As he walked, Jack reflected on how much had changed in such a short amount of time. It wasn't just his legs that were improving, it was his entire life. He was more mindful, more focused on the present moment. As he passed by the familiar houses on his block, he caught sight of Mrs. Parker again, sitting on her porch. She smiled and waved, and Jack felt a warmth in his chest. "Good afternoon, Jack," she called out. "Afternoon, Mrs. Parker," Jack replied with a smile. "How's everything going?" "Well, I can't complain," she said, her voice full of warmth. "But it's always nice to see a friendly face." Jack nodded, feeling a sense of connection to her, and to his neighborhood as a whole. He had never really noticed how much these small interactions mattered until now. He had always been so focused on his own struggles that he hadn't paid attention to the simple moments that could bring joy. The wave from Mrs. Parker, the chat with Bob at work, these were the little things that made life more fulfilling. As Jack rounded the corner back toward his house, he felt a sense of pride. Not just because his legs were getting stronger, but because he was becoming a different person, someone who took care of himself, who embraced each day with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't about achieving perfection. It wasn't about feeling no pain or discomfort. It was about consistency, about showing up for himself, day in and day out. That evening, Jack made his dinner, a simple yet satisfying plate of grilled chicken with steamed vegetables. As he sat down to eat, he realized that the true success wasn't in the small victories like losing a few pounds or feeling less pain. It was in the consistency, in the daily habits he had built that were becoming second nature. Those small actions were adding up, creating a foundation for a better future. He had learned something profound on this journey. It was the small, consistent efforts, the walking, the stretching, the mindful eating, that created lasting change. It wasn't the big leaps or dramatic transformations, but the small, daily decisions that stacked up over time. And that, Jack realized, was the secret to long-lasting health and happiness. Jack had been feeling good. Better than he had in years. The consistent stretching, the healthier eating, the walks, everything seemed to be falling into place. His legs were still sore at times, but it wasn't nearly as debilitating as before. The magnesium, stretching, and mindful breathing had become part of his daily routine, and his body seemed to respond in kind. He was more active, more present, and life felt lighter. But then, one Saturday morning, something unexpected happened. It was around 7 a.m. when Jack felt the familiar discomfort begin in his calves. At first, he thought it was just a brief twinge, nothing to worry about. But as the pain deepened, Jack realized it was more intense than usual. The cramps felt like a vice clenching around his lower legs, and no matter how much he stretched or adjusted his position, it wouldn't go away. Panic started to creep in. He grabbed his phone and texted Emily. "I don't know what's going on. The cramps are worse today. Any suggestions?" The response came quickly, as always. "Try massaging the calves gently. If it doesn't help, maybe a warm compress. You've been doing well so far, Dad. Don't let this set you back." Jack appreciated Emily's words of encouragement, but he couldn't shake the feeling of frustration. After all the effort he'd put in, after how much he had improved, why was this happening again? The thought of going backward seemed unbearable. He tried everything, stretching, massaging, the warm compress, but nothing worked. The pain was relentless, and his patience was wearing thin. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt defeated. He sank into his armchair, trying to steady his breath, but the frustration was overwhelming. The joy of improvement had been replaced by the anxiety of what this might mean. Were all his efforts for nothing? His phone buzzed again. It was a message from his old friend, Dave, who had been through his own health struggles. "Hey, Jack. I know you're dealing with the cramps again, and I get how frustrating it can be. But listen, the body is tricky. It's not always going to cooperate exactly how you want it to. I've been where you are. Don't let this moment define you. Give yourself some grace. It's all part of the process." Jack stared at the message, taking in Dave's words. It's all part of the process. Was that really the truth? Was this setback just another chapter in his journey to healing? Or was it a sign that his progress was temporary, that the pain would always be there? He wasn't sure. But Dave had been through a lot himself and had always seemed to come out stronger on the other side. Jack trusted his advice. Still, the cramp wouldn't subside, and Jack couldn't shake the nagging feeling that all his progress was slipping away. He lay back in the chair, closing his eyes and focusing on his breathing. The anxiety lingered, but slowly, he reminded himself of the big picture. This wasn't about one bad day. It was about the overall trend, the journey. The progress he had made over the past few weeks didn't vanish in an instant. He just needed to be patient and stay the course. That evening, as Jack reflected on the day, he realized something. The cramps, while undeniably frustrating, weren't the true challenge. The real challenge was how he responded to them. How he reacted when things didn't go according to plan. Could he still move forward, even when it felt like he was taking 2 steps back? The next morning, Jack woke up with a new perspective. He decided not to dwell on yesterday's pain. Instead, he focused on the tools he had learned to manage the cramps. He would stick to his routine, despite the setback, and trust that the discomfort was temporary. After breakfast, he decided to head out for his daily walk. It wasn't easy, his legs still felt tight, but he didn't let it stop him. He walked at a slower pace than usual, but he still walked. He let his thoughts wander as he moved, and before long, he found himself feeling a sense of calm. The world felt quiet and peaceful, and Jack realized how important it was to just keep moving, even when things weren't perfect. As he reached the end of his walk, Jack encountered Mrs. Parker again, sitting on her porch, as always. "Morning, Jack," she called with a warm smile. "How's your walk today?" "Good, Mrs. Parker," Jack replied. "Just taking it easy today." She raised an eyebrow, noticing his slower pace. "You're pacing yourself, huh? That's smart. Sometimes, it's not about speed, but about consistency." Jack chuckled. "I'm learning that." "Well, I'm proud of you," she said kindly. "You're doing better than most people half your age. Keep it up." Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of pride at her words. There it was again, that encouragement from others that made all the effort feel worth it. He was on the right path. Even if the road was winding and filled with bumps, he had made progress, and that was something to be proud of. Later that afternoon, Emily called to check in. "How are you feeling, Dad?" "Better," Jack said with a smile. "I had a rough morning, but I'm not letting it get to me. Just focusing on what I can control." "That's the spirit," Emily replied. "You've been doing amazing. Don't let one setback make you feel like you're back at square one." "Thanks, Em. I needed to hear that," Jack said, grateful for his daughter's steady support. After their conversation, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. This challenge, like all others, would pass. The cramps weren't gone, but they weren't going to define his journey. What mattered was how he moved forward, how he stayed consistent, even when things didn't go as planned. And so, Jack continued with his routine. He didn't allow this setback to derail his progress. Instead, he took it as a reminder that healing was not linear. There would be good days and bad days, but each day was a chance to move closer to his goals. The unexpected challenge had tested him, but it had also reinforced a crucial lesson: consistency and patience were the real keys to lasting change. The days following Jack's setback were not easy, but they were eye-opening. He had learned to accept the unpredictability of his body and the importance of consistency, no matter how small the progress seemed. The cramps still came and went, but he refused to let them derail his efforts. He stuck to his routine, stretching in the morning, taking his walks, and eating mindfully. Slowly, he began to see how the small wins in his day-to-day life added up. One of the most important realizations Jack had was that improvement wasn't always about huge, dramatic changes. Sometimes, it was about celebrating the tiny victories, those moments that went unnoticed but made all the difference in the long run. That morning, Jack woke up with a sense of quiet optimism. The discomfort in his legs was manageable, not as intense as it had been a few days ago. It wasn't gone completely, but it was a significant improvement. He sat up, stretching gently and feeling a soft wave of gratitude wash over him. Even though the path hadn't been linear, he could feel himself getting stronger, both physically and mentally. He made his usual breakfast, a smoothie packed with spinach, banana, chia seeds, and almond milk. While it wasn't the most exciting meal, it was something he could count on to fuel him for the day. The ritual of it, the consistency, was something Jack had come to appreciate. It was more than just nourishment, it was a daily act of self-care, a small win in itself. After breakfast, he set out for his walk. As he stepped outside, the air was crisp and refreshing. Autumn was fully underway, and the leaves on the trees had transformed into a beautiful tapestry of orange, yellow, and red. Jack loved this time of year. It felt like a fresh start, a reminder that change, even in nature, was constant and inevitable. His legs felt a little stiff at first, but after a few minutes of walking, the tightness eased. He focused on the rhythm of his footsteps, the breath coming in and out steadily. It wasn't a fast walk, but it was enough. It was something he could do. And today, that was enough to feel proud of. As Jack walked through his neighborhood, he noticed the small wins happening around him. He passed Mrs. Parker again, and this time, she was sitting on her porch with a neighbor, chatting and laughing. She waved at him as he approached, her smile warm and welcoming. "Morning, Jack," she called. "How's the walk today?" "Not too bad," Jack replied. "Taking it easy. How's everything with you?" Same old," she said with a laugh. "But I've got something exciting to share. I've been gardening more this year, and it's been so rewarding to see the flowers bloom. It's the little things, you know." Jack smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. "I do know. It's all about those little things. They add up, don't they?" "Exactly," she said, her eyes twinkling. "One little flower at a time." Jack couldn't help but think about how true that was, not just for gardening, but for life in general. The small wins, the little improvements, the small victories, were what truly made a difference. It wasn't about waiting for some grand moment of transformation, it was about celebrating the tiny moments that kept him going, even on the hard days. Later that afternoon, Jack decided to do something he hadn't done in a while. He called up his old friend Dave. They hadn't talked in weeks, and Jack wanted to catch up, to share how he was doing with his health. Dave was the kind of guy who always had a positive outlook on life, and Jack needed a reminder that even the toughest challenges could be handled with the right mindset. "Hey, Dave. How've you been?" Jack asked, feeling a sense of warmth as the phone rang. "Jack. It's been too long. I'm doing well. How about you? How's the leg situation?" Jack smiled. "Actually, it's been better. The cramps are still there sometimes, but I'm doing everything I can to manage them. The walks, the stretching, the eating, it's all helping. I think I'm just learning that it's not about getting it perfect every time. It's about staying consistent and taking those small wins as they come." "That's exactly it," Dave said. "It's easy to get discouraged when things don't go according to plan. But you've got the right mindset, Jack. Those small wins add up over time, and you'll get stronger. Not just physically, but mentally too. It's all part of the journey." Jack chuckled. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about that. About how it's not about perfection, it's about progress." "Exactly. And I'll tell you something else," Dave said, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "It's the people who keep going, even when it feels tough, that end up achieving the most. You're already ahead of the game because you're showing up every day, even on the days that are hard." Jack's heart lifted at Dave's words. There was something incredibly powerful about hearing validation from someone who had been through their own struggles and come out the other side. It was a reminder that the small wins, the walks, the stretches, the meals, weren't insignificant. They were the building blocks of something much larger, something that would compound over time. As they continued to chat, Jack felt a sense of pride in his journey. It wasn't a smooth ride, and there were plenty of bumps along the way. But he was showing up every day, taking those small steps, and making progress. That evening, as Jack sat down to dinner, he realized just how much he had changed. The man who had once been consumed by pain and discomfort was now someone who appreciated the quiet, small wins of life. He had learned that the little moments mattered, that each step forward, no matter how small, was a step in the right direction. He smiled as he took a bite of his dinner, grilled chicken with a side of roasted vegetables. It wasn't a five-star meal, but it was nourishing, satisfying, and most importantly, it was part of his routine. It was another small win. Jack had come to understand that it wasn't the grand transformations that defined his success, but the steady, consistent efforts. It wasn't about fixing everything overnight, but about taking each day as it came and finding joy in the little victories. The days rolled by, and Jack found himself settling into a new rhythm. His routine of stretching, walking, and eating nutritious meals had become second nature. The constant, nagging cramps were fewer and farther between, and he felt stronger, more capable. But despite the visible progress he had made, a small seed of doubt began to take root in his mind. It wasn't the physical discomfort that bothered him now, it was the mental struggle. For all his dedication, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't quite right. The doubt lingered like a shadow, threatening to overshadow his newfound confidence. What if this was just a temporary phase? What if the cramps would come back stronger, more frequent? What if he was simply fooling himself into thinking he was healing when, deep down, his body was just hiding its weakness? One evening, as Jack sat in his favorite chair, the soft hum of the television filling the room, he found his mind wandering. The day had been a good one. He'd gone for his walk, had managed to keep the cramps at bay, and even felt a sense of accomplishment. Yet, despite all of that, a quiet voice inside him kept asking, "Is it enough?" The question gnawed at him. Was all this effort truly making a difference, or was he just staving off inevitable failure? His mind replayed moments from his past, the times when he tried to tackle something difficult only to end up disappointed. He'd been through so many phases of self-improvement, only to fall back into old habits when things got tough. This time, he wondered if it would be any different. Jack leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to quiet the doubt. But the more he tried, the louder the questions became. What if this was just another phase, one where he convinced himself he was improving, only to fall back into the same pattern? What if he had to face the reality that he'd never truly be free of the cramps? His phone buzzed on the table beside him, breaking his chain of thought. It was a message from Emily. "How's everything going, Dad? Are you still feeling good?" The message was light and casual, yet it somehow made Jack feel the weight of his own uncertainty. He stared at the screen, wondering how to answer. How could he tell Emily that, despite all the progress he had made, he still felt like something was missing? That, deep down, he feared he was just pretending to be better, tricking himself into thinking he had overcome his obstacles. Jack took a deep breath and began typing a response. "I'm doing well, Em. The cramps are still there sometimes, but they're not as bad. I've been sticking to my routine. But I'll admit, some days I wonder if it's enough. If I'm really getting better, or just managing to hold things off for a little while." He paused before hitting send, feeling a wave of vulnerability. It was hard to admit his doubts, even to his daughter. But there it was, the truth. He was still unsure of himself, still questioning whether the changes he was making would last. The response from Emily came almost instantly. "Dad, I totally get how you're feeling. But look at everything you've done. You've made incredible progress. And the fact that you're still working at it every day shows how committed you are. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. Even if you still have bad days, that doesn't mean you're failing. You're not giving up, and that's what matters." Jack smiled at her words, feeling a slight sense of relief. Emily had always been good at reminding him of the bigger picture, especially when he couldn't see it for himself. He knew she was right. But even as he typed his reply, a small part of him still wasn't convinced. "I know you're right, Em," he typed. "It's just hard sometimes, you know. I keep thinking, what if I'm just fooling myself into thinking I'm improving?" Emily's reply was quick and comforting. "You're not fooling yourself, Dad. Trust me. You're stronger than you think, and I'm so proud of everything you've done. Keep it up. You've got this." Jack set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, pondering her words. He had come so far, yet the nagging doubt still lingered. It was as if, despite all his efforts, he still feared that one day he would wake up and find that nothing had changed. The next day, Jack woke up feeling unusually tired. He had gone to bed a little later than usual the night before, and his body wasn't as rested as it typically was. When he stood up to stretch, the familiar stiffness in his legs was there, though not as severe as it had been in the past. Still, it was enough to remind him that the cramps hadn't completely disappeared. "Maybe I'm just running on empty," Jack muttered to himself as he began his usual routine. But even as he stretched and walked through his morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't progressing the way he should be. The doubt kept eating at him, and no matter how many positive affirmations he repeated, it seemed to only get louder. Later in the day, Jack went to the grocery store to pick up a few essentials. As he wandered the aisles, his mind was preoccupied with his doubts. He wasn't focused on the products he was buying or the task at hand. Instead, he was lost in his thoughts, wondering if it was all worth it. What if he couldn't fully overcome the cramps? What if this was as good as it got? As he reached the produce section, Jack's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Dave. "Hey, Jack. Just wanted to check in. How's everything going? How's the leg?" Jack stopped in his tracks, his fingers hovering over the screen. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to be honest. He typed out a message, "Hey, Dave. It's been a bit rough. The cramps are still there, and I've been feeling kind of discouraged. I'm doing everything right, but it feels like I'm not getting any better. I don't know if I can keep doing this. He sent the message and waited, feeling a sense of vulnerability wash over him. The silence stretched on, and Jack found himself wondering if Dave would even respond. But after a few moments, the reply came through. "You're doing the work, Jack. That's what counts. But listen, progress isn't always linear. There are going to be days when you feel like you've taken a step backward. That's normal. What matters is that you keep showing up. Don't measure yourself by one bad day or one rough week. Focus on the overall journey. You've got the right tools now. You're not the same person you were when you started, and that's worth celebrating." Jack read Dave's message slowly, taking in every word. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was the reassurance he needed. Dave was right. There would be ups and downs, but the key was to keep moving forward, even when it didn't feel like progress was happening. As he left the store, Jack felt a sense of clarity. The doubts would always be there, but they didn't have to control him. He could still make progress, even on the hard days. It wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jack woke up the next morning to a light drizzle outside his window. The overcast sky mirrored his mood from the previous day. The doubts were still hanging around like an unwelcome guest, lingering in the corners of his mind. But today was different. Today, he was determined to not let them control him. It was going to be another step forward, no matter how small. The moment Jack sat up in bed, he stretched, feeling the familiar stiffness in his legs. The cramps hadn't disappeared entirely, but they weren't as fierce as they had been. He sighed, grateful for the small victories. He could walk without wincing in pain every few steps. The mornings had been more manageable, but there was still this lingering concern that perhaps the improvement wasn't lasting. "Keep going," he whispered to himself, a mantra he had begun repeating each day. Small steps. He stood up and went through his usual stretching routine, focusing on loosening the tight muscles in his legs. Every stretch was a small act of defiance against the pain, a victory over the physical limitations that had once controlled him. His body still wasn't perfect, but he was starting to understand that healing was not about eliminating discomfort entirely. It was about learning to live with it, to manage it, and to keep moving forward despite it. After his stretches, Jack grabbed a quick breakfast, oatmeal with chia seeds, blueberries, and a sprinkle of cinnamon. He had come to enjoy the simplicity of it. It wasn't fancy or complicated, but it was nourishing. Just like his routine. His days had begun to feel like a series of small, nourishing acts, adding up to something bigger than he had realized. As he sat at the kitchen table, he reflected on how far he had come. Not just with the cramps, but with his mindset. A few weeks ago, the mere thought of a setback would have sent him spiraling. Now, he was starting to accept setbacks as part of the process. Healing wasn't a linear path, and he was learning to embrace the ups and downs with grace. But as the day went on, Jack couldn't ignore the familiar feeling creeping in, the anxiety that accompanied the anticipation of the next setback. The fear that the good days were just fleeting moments, and that at any time, everything could come crashing down again. It was a feeling that haunted him, even when he tried to push it away. He decided to call Emily. She had been his constant source of encouragement, always reminding him to be kind to himself. Maybe hearing her voice would help him put things in perspective. "Hey, Dad. How's it going?" Emily's cheerful voice greeted him on the other end of the line. Jack smiled. "Hey, Em. It's going okay. You know, some days are better than others." "I get that," Emily said with understanding. "But I've noticed something. You've been a lot more positive lately. It's like you've shifted your focus from the setbacks to what's actually working. I'm proud of you." Jack took a deep breath. "I'm trying, Em. But honestly, I still have this fear that I'm not getting any better." That the setbacks are just waiting to knock me down again. I know that feeling, Emily replied. But think about it this way, every setback is a chance to learn and get stronger. It's not about getting everything right, it's about how you bounce back. You've been doing that so well. Jack thought about her words for a moment. She was right, as usual. The setbacks weren't the end of the road, they were just part of the journey. It was how he responded to them that mattered. And right now, he was responding by staying consistent, by doing the work even when it felt hard. I think I needed to hear that, Jack said softly. Thank you, Em. I don't always give myself enough credit. Don't be too hard on yourself, Dad. You're doing great. Just keep at it, and take it one day at a time. Later that afternoon, Jack went for his walk. It was a gentle walk, the kind he had come to love. It wasn't about going fast or pushing himself to the limit. It was about being outside, moving his body, and feeling the rhythm of his steps. It was a quiet, peaceful time for reflection, and today, more than ever, Jack needed it. As he walked through the neighborhood, he noticed the small things, the way the raindrops clung to the leaves, the fresh smell of the earth after the rain, the sound of distant conversations drifting from open windows. There was a calmness in the world around him, and for the first time in a while, Jack allowed himself to simply be present. He had been so focused on the destination, on getting better, on conquering the cramps, that he had forgotten to appreciate the journey. He realized that even on the days when things didn't go as planned, there was still beauty in the process. There was still progress, even in the setbacks. On his way back home, Jack passed by Mrs. Parker again, who was tending to her garden despite the drizzle. She looked up and waved as he approached. "Morning, Jack. How's the walk today?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. "Not bad," Jack replied with a smile. "Just taking it easy. I've been trying to focus more on the small wins." Mrs. Parker nodded, understanding. "That's the secret, you know. We get so caught up in thinking we need to do everything perfectly. But really, it's the small things that make the biggest difference." Jack stopped and leaned against the fence. "Yeah, I've been realizing that. Even on the days that feel like setbacks, I'm still moving forward. And that counts for something." Mrs. Parker smiled kindly. "Exactly. It's about persistence, not perfection. And you've got it." As Jack continued his walk, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The doubt hadn't completely vanished, but it had lost its grip on him. He had come to accept that setbacks were just part of the journey, and he didn't need to be afraid of them. In fact, they were an essential part of growth. Each setback was a lesson, each challenge a chance to learn and build resilience. When Jack returned home, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the progress he had made. He still had a long way to go, but he was no longer afraid of the setbacks. He had learned to embrace them, to see them as opportunities rather than obstacles. And with that mindset, he knew he could continue moving forward, one small step at a time. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood as Jack stood at the window, gazing out at the sky. It had been a few weeks since his last major setback, and he had noticed something, a gradual shift in his body. The cramps, once so persistent, were now fewer and less intense. He was still mindful of his movements, still committed to his routine, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope that the worst might be behind him. But there was still one thing lingering in the back of his mind, the idea that the cramps could return without warning. Jack had learned to be cautious with his optimism, knowing all too well how quickly things could change. Despite the progress he had made, there was a part of him that couldn't fully let go of the fear that it was all temporary. It was a quiet evening, and Jack had just finished dinner, one of his usual healthy meals, full of leafy greens, whole grains, and plenty of lean protein. He had even added some avocado, knowing how good it was for his muscles. Jack had become more aware of the way food affected his body over the last few months, and he was determined to make the most of it. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing in his healing process. As he wiped his mouth with a napkin, Jack's phone buzzed. "Hey, Jack. Just wanted to check in. How's everything going?" It was a text from Dave. Jack paused for a moment, debating whether to reply. He hadn't spoken to Dave much recently, but his message reminded Jack that there was always room for improvement, even when things seemed to be going well. He typed a quick response. "Hey, Dave. It's been good. The cramps are still there, but much less frequent. I think my routine is helping. But honestly, I'm still kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, you know. I just keep wondering if I'm doing enough." A few moments later, Dave responded. "You're doing more than enough, Jack. But you're right, healing takes time, and it's okay to be cautious. Just remember, the work you're putting in every day is making a difference. And sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs come when you least expect them." Jack sat back in his chair, letting Dave's words sink in. It was true. He had been so focused on the effort that he hadn't given himself the credit he deserved. The progress was real, even if it wasn't perfect. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was a sound that took Jack by surprise. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he stood up and walked toward the door, his curiosity piqued. When he opened it, he was greeted by the sight of a familiar face. "Hey, Jack. I hope I'm not interrupting anything," Mrs. Parker called out from the doorstep, holding a small basket in her hands. Her eyes twinkled with a mischievous spark. "I brought you something." Jack blinked in surprise. Mrs. Parker was a kind and thoughtful neighbor, always quick with a smile or a word of encouragement, but it wasn't every day she showed up unannounced. "Mrs. Parker. What's all this?" She smiled warmly and handed him the basket. "Just a little something to show my appreciation for your hard work. I thought you might enjoy it." Jack took the basket from her hands, still unsure what to make of it. Inside, nestled among some fresh herbs and a few bright green zucchinis, was a small jar of honey and a collection of homemade granola bars. Jack couldn't help but grin. "You made these?" he asked, impressed. "I did." Mrs. Parker beamed. "I know you've been working so hard to take care of yourself, and I thought maybe a little something special might help. Sometimes, it's the simple things that make the biggest difference." Jack's heart warmed at the gesture. It was such a simple act of kindness, but it spoke volumes. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. This really means a lot." She patted his shoulder gently. "You're welcome, Jack. I know it's not always easy to keep going, but you're doing great. Just remember, don't forget to treat yourself along the way. Progress isn't just about the work, it's about enjoying the small rewards too." With that, Mrs. Parker gave him a wink and turned to leave, leaving Jack standing on his doorstep, the basket in hand. Her words lingered in his mind as he closed the door behind him. As he sat down at the kitchen table, Jack unwrapped one of the granola bars and took a bite. The sweetness of the honey combined with the crunch of the oats and nuts was comforting in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the food that felt good, it was the thought behind it. Someone cared enough to offer a small, simple gift to make his journey just a little bit easier. In that moment, Jack realized something important. He had been so focused on pushing himself and doing everything right, that he had forgotten to enjoy the process. He had forgotten that healing wasn't just about progress, it was also about savoring the small moments of joy along the way. After finishing the granola bar, Jack sat back and allowed himself to fully appreciate the quiet evening. The cramps, though still present, didn't define him. They were a part of his journey, but they didn't control his life anymore. He was stronger, more resilient, and more willing to embrace the ups and downs as they came. And for the first time in a long while, Jack let himself simply rest in the knowledge that he was doing enough. He wasn't perfect, and his journey wasn't over, but he had made real progress. The setbacks would still come, and he would face them as best as he could, but today, Jack was going to let himself be proud of the steps he had taken so far. The next few days passed in a blur of small victories and occasional setbacks. Jack had learned to expect both, and somehow, it made the entire process a little easier to handle. His routine had become second nature. He stretched in the morning, ate his carefully chosen meals, and made time for light exercise. While the cramps weren't completely gone, they were significantly reduced, and Jack could feel his body becoming stronger, more resilient with each passing day. But something was still off. Jack felt like he was missing something. He had been so focused on improving his physical health, on beating the cramps, that he had neglected something just as important, his mental well-being. It wasn't until a conversation with Dave that Jack began to see things more clearly. One evening, as Jack settled into his armchair with a book in hand, his phone buzzed again. It was Dave. "Hey, Jack. Mind if we chat for a minute?" Jack smiled, glad for the opportunity to catch up. "Sure, what's up?" "Well, I've been thinking about what you said the other day. About how you're still waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it got me thinking, how much of that fear is actually about your body, and how much of it is about your mind?" Jack blinked, taken aback by the question. "What do you mean?" "Look," Dave said, his voice thoughtful, "you've been doing all the right things physically, but I think you're still holding on to some mental baggage. You've been through a lot, and I think you might still be carrying some of that fear and doubt from the past. The body isn't the only thing that needs healing, Jack. Your mind needs to catch up too." Jack let the words sink in. He had always been so focused on managing his physical health that he hadn't stopped to consider how much of his mental state was affecting his progress. The fear of the cramps returning, the constant second-guessing of whether he was doing enough, it all came from a place of anxiety and doubt, not just his muscles and joints. "You're right," Jack admitted quietly. "I've been so obsessed with my body's progress that I've completely ignored my mind. I'm not sure how to let go of this fear." Dave chuckled softly. "It's not something you can just let go of overnight, Jack. But it's about learning to shift your focus. The fear is always going to be there, but it doesn't have to control you. You have to find peace with it, accept it as part of the journey, and not let it dictate your actions." Jack was quiet for a moment. "I've been so scared of things getting worse that I haven't allowed myself to feel better." "Does that even make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Dave replied. "But here's the thing, fear is a natural part of any recovery process. You're going to face moments of doubt, but you can't let them stop you. You need to accept that progress isn't linear, and setbacks don't erase the progress you've already made." Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of Dave's words settling into his mind. He realized that while he had made great strides physically, he had neglected to address the emotional aspect of his healing. The fear, the anxiety, and the doubt were all part of the process. And it was time to face them head-on, instead of letting them hold him back. That night, Jack lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The thought of letting go of his fear felt liberating, yet terrifying at the same time. How could he stop worrying about the cramps when they had been such a constant presence in his life? But then again, he realized that he had been so focused on the fear itself that he hadn't noticed how much it was affecting his everyday life. He had spent years living in anticipation of the worst-case scenario, always bracing for the next flare-up, the next setback. But now, he saw that it was time to break free from that cycle. He had to accept that life was unpredictable, that there would always be moments of uncertainty. But that didn't mean he couldn't find peace in the midst of it. The next morning, Jack woke up with a new sense of clarity. As he went through his stretching routine, he focused not just on the physical movements, but on his breath, on calming his mind. He allowed himself to be present in the moment, to embrace the discomfort without fear. It wasn't about forcing his body to be perfect, it was about accepting it as it was and moving forward from there. Later that day, Jack went for a walk through the neighborhood, something he had come to enjoy. As he strolled along the familiar path, he felt a subtle shift within himself. It was a small change, but it felt significant. The fear that had once hovered over him like a storm cloud was still there, but it no longer held the same power. Instead of letting the fear control him, Jack was learning to coexist with it, to move forward despite it. As he walked past Mrs. Parker's house again, she waved from her garden, a basket of freshly picked tomatoes in her hands. "Morning, Jack," she called out with a warm smile. "How's the walking today?" Jack smiled back, feeling lighter than he had in days. "Better, Mrs. Parker. A lot better." She raised an eyebrow in playful curiosity. "Something different about you today. You seem lighter. Like you found something." Jack chuckled softly. "Maybe I have." He continued his walk, his pace steady and relaxed. The world around him seemed to be a little brighter, a little clearer, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the progress he had made, not just in his body, but in his mind as well. In that moment, Jack realized something profound. Healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about learning to live with the broken parts, to embrace the imperfections and move forward despite them. His body had made progress, but so had his mind. And with that balance, he was ready to face whatever came next. The calm Jack had been feeling in the days following his conversation with Dave wasn't destined to last. Life, as it often did, had other plans for him. One chilly morning, when the sky was just beginning to blush with the first rays of dawn, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks, a sharp, unmistakable pain in his leg. His heart dropped, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. He had been feeling so good, hadn't the cramps been easing up? Hadn't he just started to believe that the worst was behind him? But now, as the sudden wave of pain rippled through his calf, Jack realized that his journey was far from over. Gritting his teeth, Jack tried to stretch out the cramp, moving slowly and deliberately. He placed his hands on his leg, willing it to loosen, but the muscles refused to relax. The pain didn't subside. In fact, it felt like the cramp was digging in deeper, mocking him for thinking that he had it under control. Jack breathed in deeply, his mind racing. The fear he had worked so hard to ease, the very thing he had just begun to manage, came flooding back in an instant. He couldn't help it. The old feelings of helplessness, frustration, and dread washed over him. What if it's worse this time, he thought. What if this is just the beginning? What if I'll never get better? He stayed frozen for a moment, caught in the grip of the pain and the fear. Then, slowly, he allowed himself to remember what he had learned. The progress he'd made wasn't invalidated by a setback. He had been through hard times before, and he had always found a way forward. This cramp, painful as it was, didn't define him. It didn't undo everything. With that thought, Jack forced himself to stand up, despite the sharp pain. The cramp had subsided somewhat, but the nagging sensation still lingered, a cruel reminder of how unpredictable his healing journey could be. Taking small, careful steps, Jack went to the kitchen and made himself some tea. As he waited for the water to boil, he pulled out his phone and texted Dave. "Hey, I could use a little advice. Got hit with a cramp this morning. Not sure what I'm doing wrong." Dave's response came almost immediately. "Don't panic, Jack. A setback doesn't mean everything's lost. The body's always adjusting. Sometimes it takes a little while to find that balance. Have you been stretching like you usually do?" Jack thought for a moment. "Yeah, I have. But maybe I pushed too hard yesterday. I went for a long walk, and I think it might have triggered something." "That could be it," Dave replied. "The key is to listen to your body. If it feels off, take a step back and let it recover. You've made incredible progress, but it's still important not to push yourself too hard." Jack read the text and nodded, even though Dave couldn't see him. He knew Dave was right. He had gotten so caught up in his desire to push through the discomfort, to keep going despite the challenges, that he had ignored the signs his body was sending him. He had pushed himself too far too soon, and now, he was paying the price. The kettle whistled, and Jack poured himself a hot cup of tea. As he sat down at the kitchen table, he tried to steady his racing thoughts. Yes, he had made progress. Yes, he had learned to take care of his body and mind. But that didn't mean he could ignore his limits. Healing was a delicate balance, and it required patience, not just with his body, but with himself. The rest of the day passed slowly, Jack taking care to rest and hydrate, knowing that he needed to give his leg the space to heal. He thought about his conversation with Dave and the lessons he had learned over the past few weeks. It wasn't always going to be a smooth ride. There would be setbacks, like this cramp, but that didn't mean he was back at square one. It simply meant that he had to adjust and keep moving forward, no matter how slow the process might feel. The following day, Jack woke up to a dull ache in his leg, but it was manageable. He stretched carefully, allowing his muscles to ease into the movement. He took a long, slow walk around the block, giving himself time to notice the way his body felt at each step, making sure not to push too hard. Throughout the day, Jack checked in with his body. It wasn't perfect, there was still some discomfort, some tightness, but it was nothing compared to what he had experienced before. And most importantly, the fear that had crept in the day before hadn't taken hold. Yes, the cramp had returned, but it wasn't the end of his progress. It was just another moment in the journey, one that he could handle. That night, as Jack lay in bed, he reflected on everything he had learned. He had realized that recovery wasn't a linear path, it was full of twists and turns. Some days would be better than others, but each step, even the setbacks, was part of the process. He no longer viewed the cramps as a sign of failure. They were simply a reminder that he was human, that healing was complex, and that he needed to be gentle with himself along the way. Before falling asleep, Jack smiled. Despite the setback, he felt more at peace with his journey than ever before. There would be bumps along the way, and sometimes, those bumps would be painful, but he knew now that he had the strength to face them. The cramps didn't define him. His ability to move forward, to keep going despite the pain, was what truly mattered. Jack woke up the next morning with a slight twinge in his leg, but nothing like the intense cramp he had felt the day before. It was a reminder that progress wasn't always obvious, and some days would be harder than others. He had learned to embrace those days with a sense of calm he hadn't known before. It was all part of the journey, and there was no need to rush it. As he sipped his morning coffee, Jack thought about the concept of patience. It had always been something he struggled with. He had always been the kind of person who pushed hard for results, whether it was in his career, his relationships, or his health. But this was different. This healing process wasn't something he could rush. He had to take it one step at a time, trust his body, and allow it to heal at its own pace. It was easy to get frustrated when things didn't happen as quickly as he wanted them to, but Jack was starting to realize that rushing through the process would only make things worse. He needed to be kind to himself, to allow room for mistakes, setbacks, and even discomfort. Healing wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. That afternoon, Jack decided to go for another walk, but this time, he focused even more on the rhythm of his movements. He allowed his body to lead, rather than pushing himself to go further or faster. The slow, mindful walk felt almost meditative. Each step was an opportunity to check in with how his body was feeling, to honor the progress he had made, and to accept the limitations he still had. The sun was warm on his back, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the trees around him. He passed Mrs. Parker's garden again, and she waved from her porch. "Hey there, Jack. Looking good today," she called, her smile as bright as always. Jack waved back, feeling a sense of gratitude for her constant support. "Thanks, Mrs. Parker. Just taking it slow today." "Slow and steady, that's the way to go," she called out, chuckling. Jack smiled at her words. Slow and steady. That was exactly what he needed to remember. It wasn't about rushing to the finish line, it was about pacing himself and allowing the journey to unfold as it would. Later that day, as Jack settled into his evening routine, he pulled out his phone and texted Dave. He knew the cramp from the previous day was still lingering in his mind, and he wanted to check in. "Hey, Dave, I'm doing better today. The cramp is still there a bit, but it's not as bad. I've been taking it easy, trying to listen to my body more. Dave's response came quickly. That's great to hear, Jack. You're doing the right thing. Healing takes time. Just remember to be patient with yourself. It's not about being perfect every day, it's about consistency over time. You've already made so much progress. Jack smiled as he read the message. The words felt like a gentle affirmation of what he already knew deep down. He had been so focused on fixing things quickly that he hadn't truly understood the power of patience. Now, he was beginning to see how important it was to take things one step at a time and to allow his body the space it needed to heal. The next morning, Jack woke up to a sense of quiet optimism. He had decided that today would be another slow, mindful day. He would focus on doing everything with care, his stretches, his meals, his walks, and he would do it all without rushing. The cramp was still there in the background, but he didn't let it dominate his thoughts. He simply acknowledged it, as one would acknowledge a passing cloud, and continued on with his day. As he went through his stretches, he remembered something else Dave had said during one of their earlier conversations: you have to treat your body like it's a long-term project, not a quick fix. Jack had taken that to heart, and it was helping him shift his mindset. His body wasn't broken. It was in the process of healing, and he needed to honor that process without expecting miracles. By the afternoon, Jack felt light, almost as though a weight had been lifted. His movements were smoother, and the tension in his leg had loosened even further. It was a small change, but it felt significant. And for the first time in a while, he realized that the small victories, the quiet progress, were just as important as the big ones. Later that evening, Jack sat on his back porch, watching the sunset as the sky shifted from gold to pink to deep blue. The air was cool and refreshing, and the evening felt full of possibility. For the first time in weeks, Jack didn't feel the weight of his fear or anxiety pressing down on him. He wasn't obsessed with the cramps. He wasn't worrying about whether or not they would return. He was simply here, in the moment, appreciating the progress he had made and the lessons he had learned along the way. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. His body was healing. It wasn't perfect, but it was getting there. And that was enough. Jack's days had slowly found a rhythm, each one an opportunity for him to re-establish a sense of control over his body and his health. But no matter how calm and steady he had become, there was always a small part of him that remained anxious, a quiet voice in the back of his mind that worried the cramps might return in full force. However, a breakthrough was on the horizon, though Jack didn't see it coming. It all started on a Wednesday morning, when the weather was still crisp from the tail end of fall. Jack had been feeling unusually good that morning, stronger, more energized, with less tension in his legs than he'd had in weeks. The pain that had once plagued him was now reduced to a faint, almost imperceptible thrum, something he barely noticed as he moved through his morning routine. For the first time in a while, he felt like he could take on the day without fear or hesitation. After finishing his stretches and a light breakfast, Jack decided to try something he hadn't done in months: a jog. Not a long, grueling run, but just a light, easy jog, something that would allow him to test his limits while still being mindful of his body's needs. He had learned the hard way not to overdo it, but this felt like the right time to see how far he had truly come. He laced up his sneakers, stepped out the door, and started with a slow jog down the street. His feet hit the pavement with a soft rhythm, and Jack allowed himself to enjoy the motion, the wind in his face, the steady thud of his heart, the feeling of his muscles waking up. At first, it was awkward, his body not entirely sure of the movement. But after a few minutes, something incredible happened: his body began to find its flow. His legs were lighter than they had been in a long time, and there was no sign of the intense cramping he had become so accustomed to. He wasn't running fast or hard, he was simply jogging, keeping the pace easy and controlled, but it was more than he had expected. He felt free, the familiar sense of strength returning with each step. By the time Jack had circled the block a few times, he was almost dizzy with excitement. He had expected discomfort, maybe a cramp or two, but there had been none. The pain that had been a constant shadow was nowhere to be found, and for the first time in a long time, Jack began to believe in the possibility of a life free from cramps altogether. He slowed to a walk and caught his breath, standing on the corner of his street and looking out at the neighborhood that had been his home for so many years. Everything looked different somehow, brighter, more vibrant, as though his world had shifted with his newfound strength. "Jack!" Mrs. Parker called from across the street, a huge grin on her face as she waved him over. "You look like you're flying. I haven't seen you move that fast in months." Jack laughed, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't realized he was missing. "You're right, Mrs. Parker. It's the first time I've felt this good in so long. I think the cramps are finally behind me." "Well, I'm so happy for you," Mrs. Parker said, walking over to him. "You've been working so hard, Jack. You deserve this. I knew you'd get there." Jack beamed. Her words hit him in a way he hadn't expected. For so long, he had doubted himself, doubted whether he could truly overcome the cramps, whether he could ever get back to living a full life. But now, standing there with Mrs. Parker's encouraging words ringing in his ears, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Thanks, Mrs. Parker. It feels like I'm finally getting my life back." "Well, keep at it," she said, patting his arm. "I know you will." As Jack walked back to his house, he reflected on what had just happened. It wasn't just the jog that felt like a breakthrough. It was the fact that he had trusted his body, listened to the signals it was giving him, and allowed himself to take that next step without fear. That was the real victory. Later that evening, Jack sat down with his phone to send Dave a message. He had to share the good news. "Hey, Dave. Guess what? I just went for a jog. A real one. And I didn't feel a single cramp. It was amazing." The response came quickly. "That's awesome, Jack. I knew you were getting there. You've been so patient with yourself, and it's paying off." Jack smiled at the words, his heart swelling with pride. He had worked so hard to reach this point, and now, for the first time in a long while, he could see the fruits of his labor. The journey wasn't over yet, there would still be challenges ahead, and Jack knew there would still be moments of fear and uncertainty. But he had reached a milestone. He had taken control of his body and his health, and he was beginning to believe in the possibility of lasting change. That night, as Jack lay in bed, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the fear, the setbacks, the small victories, and the breakthroughs. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel truly grateful for the progress he had made. The cramps hadn't disappeared entirely, but Jack didn't need them to anymore. He had found his strength, and that was all he needed to keep moving forward. Jack's life had begun to take on a new form, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was living in a space of freedom he hadn't known before. His body, once a source of pain and frustration, was now becoming a vessel for strength and vitality. But even as he embraced this newfound hope, Jack was learning that recovery wasn't just about the physical, it was about shifting his mindset and embracing a new approach to life itself. It wasn't that he no longer had fears or doubts, no, they still crept in occasionally, especially on the days when he felt a little off. But now, when the fear of cramps or pain would arise, Jack had learned to manage it. He had learned that it was okay to not be in control of every moment, but he could still be in control of how he responded. That Wednesday afternoon, Jack decided to try something else, a little experiment. Since he had successfully jogged for the first time without issue, he felt ready to push his limits just a bit further. But instead of diving into another jog, he opted for something he'd always been curious about but hadn't tried: yoga. He had heard great things about how yoga could benefit flexibility and overall muscle health, and he had been reading up on the practice for a while. He had even heard that some people who dealt with leg cramps found yoga to be incredibly effective in preventing them. It seemed like a natural next step. Jack took a deep breath and spread out his yoga mat in the living room, setting up a space where he could focus. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the fan and the distant sound of birds chirping outside. It felt like a peaceful space, one that invited relaxation and calmness. He turned on a beginner's video on YouTube and took a seat, unsure of what to expect but willing to give it a shot. As the instructor's voice filled the room, Jack followed along as best as he could. The first few poses felt awkward, he had never been very flexible, and his muscles weren't used to moving in this way. But there was something about the gentle pace of the practice that immediately appealed to him. It wasn't about pushing his body to its limits, it was about listening to his body and honoring its needs. As the session continued, Jack found himself becoming more attuned to his body, focusing on his breath and the flow of the movements. It was a different experience than anything he had tried before, and he was surprised at how good it felt. It wasn't just physical, there was a mental release that came with it. The tension in his body started to melt away, and the nervous energy that had accompanied him for so long began to ease. By the time the instructor guided the class into a seated position to finish the session, Jack felt a deep sense of relaxation. The practice had been meditative, almost like a reset for his mind and body. His legs felt looser, his muscles more at ease, and even his breathing was calmer. When the session ended, Jack sat still on the mat for a few moments, savoring the peace he felt. He had always thought of yoga as something for others, something that wasn't for someone like him. But now, as he reflected on the session, he realized how wrong he had been. It was a practice that anyone could embrace, and it was exactly what he needed. Later that night, Jack decided to call Dave and share his experience. "Hey, Dave, I tried yoga today," Jack said, his voice brimming with excitement. "It was amazing. I didn't expect it to feel so good." "That's awesome, Jack." Dave replied, his tone warm. "Yoga's a great practice for so many things. It's gentle on the body, and it really helps with flexibility and muscle recovery. Plus, it's great for mental clarity. You should keep it up." Jack smiled as he listened to Dave. "I think I will. It felt really good for my legs, and honestly, I think it helped my mindset, too. It wasn't just about the cramps anymore. It was about slowing down and really listening to what my body needs." "That's the key right there," Dave said. "It's about listening to your body, respecting it, and honoring its limits. That's how you continue to progress without pushing yourself too hard." Jack nodded, even though Dave couldn't see him. "You're right. I've learned that the hard way. But I think I'm getting the hang of it." The next few days were a blur of small, mindful changes. Jack made yoga a part of his daily routine, and the more he practiced, the better he felt. His legs became stronger and more flexible, and the cramps that once seemed inevitable started to feel like a distant memory. But it wasn't just the physical changes that Jack noticed. His entire perspective on health and healing began to shift. No longer was it just about fixing the cramps. It was about creating balance in his life, both physically and mentally. He began eating more mindfully, incorporating more whole foods into his meals, and drinking plenty of water. He prioritized rest and relaxation, finding a new sense of calm in his daily life. One day, after another successful yoga session, Jack sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, reflecting on how far he had come. The road had been long, and there had been moments of doubt and fear. But now, as he looked out the window at the world around him, he realized that he had found a new path, one that wasn't about forcing his body into something it wasn't ready for, but about gently guiding it toward strength, peace, and recovery. The cramps weren't gone completely, but they no longer held power over him. Jack knew that his journey wasn't over, that there would be setbacks, and there would be days when things didn't go as planned. But he also knew that he had the tools to handle them now. Patience, consistency, and mindfulness had become his guiding principles, and they had already proven to be enough. Jack finished his tea and smiled to himself. He was no longer defined by his struggles. He was defined by his ability to rise above them, to find strength in the face of adversity, and to embrace a life of balance and peace. And as he set his cup down and looked out at the setting sun, Jack realized that he was exactly where he needed to be. Jack's journey to recovery had been a series of wins, small victories that, when added up, made him feel like he was finally in control of his life again. But as with all progress, there were days when the road wasn't as smooth as he had hoped. It wasn't that Jack had forgotten his struggles or gotten too complacent, no, the reality was simply that healing wasn't linear. There would be ups and downs, twists and turns, and some days, Jack would be reminded that even the most determined efforts didn't guarantee an easy ride. It all started on a Thursday morning, a day that seemed like it would be just like any other. Jack woke up feeling good, well rested after a solid 8 hours of sleep, and ready to tackle the day. He followed his usual routine, stretching, drinking his water, and preparing a light breakfast. The sun was just beginning to peek through the blinds of his living room, casting warm light across the room as he set out his yoga mat. But as Jack moved through his stretches, something felt off. At first, it was subtle, a twinge in his right calf, a small, sharp sensation that he quickly brushed off as nothing. He had been practicing yoga diligently for weeks now, and his body had been responding well. Still, the memory of those terrible cramps was never far from his mind. He knew all too well that one wrong move, one wrong twist, could trigger something terrible. Determined not to let it get the best of him, Jack continued through his routine, hoping the discomfort would subside. But as he moved into a deep lunge, the feeling in his calf intensified. The sharp sting quickly turned into a dull ache, and suddenly, his body tensed up in familiar fear. "Not again," Jack muttered under his breath. He stopped immediately, sitting down on the mat, rubbing his leg with his hands, willing the pain to ease. His mind raced with frustration. After all the work he'd put in, after all the progress he'd made, how could this happen now? Had he overdone it? Had he pushed too hard, too fast? Taking a few deep breaths, Jack tried to steady his thoughts. He knew that panicking wouldn't help. He had come so far, he couldn't let one setback undo everything he had accomplished. So, he did what he had been taught, he listened to his body. He gently stretched the area, trying to ease the tension in his calf, and made a mental note to slow down for the next few days. His body was sending him a message, one that he couldn't ignore. But despite his efforts, the ache in his calf lingered throughout the day. Jack kept to his routine, avoiding anything too strenuous, but the nagging pain wouldn't fully go away. He was frustrated, unsure of what had gone wrong. He had been so careful, so mindful of his progress. Why had his body decided to rebel now? Later that afternoon, Jack called Dave, feeling a sense of worry creeping in. He needed someone to talk to. "Hey, Dave," Jack said when his friend answered. "I think I might have overdone it today. I was doing yoga, and I felt this weird pain in my calf. It's not a cramp, but it won't go away, and I'm kind of freaking out." "Ah, man, I hear you," Dave replied. "It's frustrating when you've been feeling so good, and then something unexpected happens. But, listen, it might just be a minor strain. Sometimes our muscles need a little more recovery time than we think. You've been pushing yourself really hard, and your body might be telling you to slow down just a little." Jack sighed. "I guess that makes sense. I just don't want to go back to how I was before. I've been feeling so good lately." "I totally get that," Dave said. "But remember, setbacks are a part of the process. You're going to have days where things don't go as planned, but it's all about how you respond to them. If you give yourself the time to heal, it'll pass. Just take it easy for a few days, stretch, and stay on top of your hydration. You've got this." Jack smiled, feeling a bit more at ease. Dave had a way of calming his worries, reminding him that the setbacks didn't define the journey. It wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence, and finding the strength to keep going even when things weren't ideal. "Thanks, man," Jack said. "I think I needed to hear that." After hanging up, Jack spent the rest of the day resting his leg. He didn't push himself, opting for a gentle walk around the block and more stretching in the evening. It wasn't the intense workout he had hoped for, but he knew it was the right choice for his body in that moment. The next day, Jack woke up with a bit more flexibility in his calf. It wasn't 100% back to normal, but it was progress. Jack decided to take the weekend off from yoga and focus on restorative practices. He spent time meditating and practicing deep breathing, giving his muscles time to rest and recover. By Monday, the pain had largely subsided, but Jack remained cautious. He didn't want to jump back into things too quickly. It was tempting to return to his routine, but he had learned that it wasn't worth rushing. The cramps and aches would return if he wasn't careful. It was during this time of forced rest that Jack had an epiphany: recovery wasn't just about pushing forward. It was also about knowing when to step back, to listen, and to give his body the space it needed to heal. He realized that sometimes the best thing he could do for himself was nothing at all. The true challenge wasn't overcoming the setbacks, it was learning how to respond to them with patience and understanding. By the time the following week rolled around, Jack was back to his yoga routine, but this time, he approached it with a new mindset. He was more in tune with his body's needs, less focused on pushing himself to the limit, and more focused on nurturing his recovery. The setback hadn't been the end, it had been a reminder to continue honoring his body, to respect its limits, and to remember that healing was a process. And with that, Jack took another step forward, this time, more aware of his body's signals and more committed to a balanced, sustainable approach to his health. Jack sat quietly on the edge of his bed that morning, looking out the window as sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting a warm glow on the room. His calf felt better, still a little tender, but the sharp, nagging pain had faded into a dull ache, one he could manage. He had spent the last few days focusing on recovery, keeping things light and gentle, and he was starting to feel the benefits. His yoga practice had resumed, but with more caution, more mindfulness. And it was working. Jack was beginning to understand that true recovery wasn't just about pushing through pain or trying to force his body into submission. It was about patience, patience with himself, patience with the process, and patience with his body. Over the past few weeks, Jack had discovered something profound: recovery wasn't a destination, it was an ongoing journey. There would always be bumps along the road, challenges to face, and unexpected hurdles to overcome. But each one of those moments taught him something. And the lessons, while often difficult, were invaluable. Jack's phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a text from Dave. "How's the leg feeling? I hope you're taking it easy." Jack smiled and typed back, "Feeling better. Took it easy over the weekend. Just some light stretching and rest. Back at it slowly. Thanks for the advice, man." He set the phone down and walked into the kitchen, where he started preparing a breakfast of oatmeal, topped with sliced bananas, chia seeds, and a handful of almonds. He'd learned the importance of fueling his body with the right foods, not just for recovery, but for overall health. He wasn't just focused on the cramps anymore, he was focused on nourishing his body from the inside out. As he sat down to eat, Jack reflected on everything he'd learned over the past few months. He had started this journey frustrated and overwhelmed, trapped by a series of leg cramps that had kept him from living the active life he wanted. Now, after all his research, trial and error, and small victories, he had a new perspective. He was no longer defined by the cramps, he was defined by his ability to overcome them. Still, there was one thing that Jack hadn't fully reckoned with: the mental side of his recovery. Sure, he had the physical tools in place: his yoga practice, his diet, his hydration, and his daily routines. But the mental game had been just as important. The mental strength to endure the setbacks, to show up every day, even when things didn't feel perfect, that was something Jack had learned to cultivate over time. And it wasn't just about the cramps. It was about life in general. He had learned that sometimes things would not go as planned. Sometimes, the unexpected would derail his progress. But the key was not letting those moments define him. He had learned to roll with the punches, to face adversity head-on, and to find peace in the uncertainty of life. Later that day, Jack was out for a walk in the park, enjoying the crisp air and the sound of leaves crunching beneath his feet. It was a simple pleasure, one he might have overlooked in the past. He had always been so focused on achieving something, whether it was running faster, lifting heavier, or overcoming his leg cramps, that he hadn't taken time to enjoy the quiet moments in between. As he strolled, he saw a couple sitting on a bench, talking and laughing together. Their easy camaraderie was a stark contrast to Jack's earlier struggles. He realized that the couple, much like him, had probably gone through their own set of challenges in life, yet they were finding joy in the simple moments. And in that moment, Jack understood something deeply: there was beauty in the struggle, but there was also beauty in the recovery. It was all a part of the process. When he returned home, Jack went through his routine: a light stretch, some water, and a healthy dinner. But tonight, he decided to do something a little different. Instead of watching TV or reading, he sat down and wrote in his journal. It was a practice he had started a few weeks ago, one that helped him process his thoughts and reflect on his journey. He wrote, "I've been thinking a lot about patience lately. Not just with my body, but with myself. The last few months have been a reminder that healing doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process, and that's okay. I've had setbacks, and I'll probably have more. But I've learned to approach them with patience, knowing that every small step forward is a victory. I can't control everything, but I can control how I respond." Jack paused for a moment, rereading the words he had written. The more he reflected, the more he realized how far he had come. The pain of the past no longer held him captive. The fear of another cramp didn't control his every decision. He was learning to live in the present moment, to appreciate the small wins, and to acknowledge that setbacks were simply part of the journey. He closed his journal and put it on the table. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt truly at peace with where he was. He had reached a place of acceptance, not just with his body, but with the process of recovery itself. The road ahead was still uncertain. He knew there would be moments of doubt, times when the cramps might return, or when his body would need more rest. But Jack also knew that he had the tools to face whatever came next. More importantly, he had the mindset that would carry him through: patience, perseverance, and a commitment to listening to his body, no matter what. As Jack turned off the light and climbed into bed, he felt a sense of quiet pride. The journey was far from over, but he was no longer afraid of the obstacles that lay ahead. He was ready to face whatever came his way, with patience in his heart and strength in his body. The morning sun filtered softly through the curtains as Jack sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He had been awake for a while, savoring the quiet of the early hours, before the world outside his home came alive. His calf felt as good as it had in months: strong, resilient, and most importantly, free from any lingering pain. It was a moment of peace, one that he'd worked tirelessly to achieve. Looking out the window, Jack reflected on the journey that had brought him to this place. The early days of cramping, the frustration, the desperation for a solution, and then the slow, steady climb out of that darkness, all of it had led to this quiet, peaceful morning. It wasn't just about the physical healing, it was about learning to face challenges head-on, to approach setbacks with patience, and to embrace the power of self-care. But beyond the physical recovery, Jack realized he had learned something even more profound. He had learned to listen to his body, yes, but more importantly, he had learned to listen to himself. To trust his instincts. To accept that healing, whether physical or emotional, wasn't always about quick fixes or dramatic results. Sometimes, it was about taking small, steady steps toward improvement, and allowing yourself the grace to grow along the way. He reached for his phone and saw a message from Dave. "How's the leg, my friend? Ready to get back to it?" Jack smiled and replied with a simple but heartfelt message. "Better than ever. Honestly, I think I'm ready for whatever comes next. The road hasn't been easy, but I've learned more than I ever expected." He put the phone down and took a deep breath. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to experience, but for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel the urgency to rush. He had reached a place of balance, an understanding that progress wasn't always a straight line, but rather a winding path that required patience, effort, and reflection. And that, to him, was a victory. The past few months had changed him in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. Yes, the leg cramps were still in the back of his mind, but they no longer defined him. They didn't dictate his actions or control his thoughts. Instead, he had learned how to take care of his body, how to nurture it, and how to recover when things went wrong. But more importantly, he had learned the importance of slowing down, of listening to his body, and understanding that healing, both physical and mental, required time. Jack's journey had taught him that every setback, every obstacle, was a chance to grow. He had learned that life wasn't about avoiding the hard moments, but about embracing them. When faced with adversity, it wasn't the challenge itself that mattered, it was how you responded. Jack had chosen to respond with resilience, with patience, and with an openness to change. As the day wore on, Jack decided to head outside for a walk. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing as it kissed his skin, and the world around him seemed to hum with life. He walked with purpose, no longer rushing to reach a destination, but instead savoring the journey itself. The simple act of walking, something he had once taken for granted, was now a celebration of how far he had come. And it wasn't just about the physical recovery. It was about appreciating the smaller moments, the simple pleasures of life. Jack smiled as he passed by a family in the park, a little girl laughing as she chased after a ball. He saw the elderly couple sitting on the same bench where he had once observed them, their easy laughter carrying through the air. Life, it seemed, was always in motion, always moving forward, always changing. And that's when it hit him. Jack had been so focused on recovering from the cramps, on fixing his body, that he had almost forgotten something even more important, that the journey was not just about physical healing. It was about living. Truly living. There was a freedom in accepting that the road wasn't always going to be smooth, that there would always be challenges. But there was also a freedom in knowing that he could face those challenges head-on, that he could choose how to respond. He wasn't a victim of his circumstances, he was the author of his own story. Later that evening, as Jack sat down to dinner, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His journey had been difficult at times, but it had brought him to a place of strength, of clarity, and of peace. He had learned how to take care of himself, how to nourish his body with the right foods, how to listen to his body's signals, and how to move forward when things got tough. The cramps were no longer his focus. They had once been his greatest fear, his most persistent challenge. But now, they were just a part of the story, a chapter that had taught him valuable lessons about patience, self-care, and resilience. As he finished his meal and cleaned up the kitchen, Jack realized that he wasn't just moving forward physically, he was moving forward in every aspect of his life. His health was just one piece of the puzzle. He had learned to embrace each part of the process, to value the highs and lows equally, and to trust in the journey, no matter where it took him. That night, as Jack lay in bed, ready to drift off to sleep, he felt a deep sense of contentment. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he was ready for whatever came next. The cramps, the setbacks, the struggles, they were all just part of the adventure. And Jack had learned how to face it all with courage, patience, and the unwavering belief that every step forward was a step towards something greater. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?